We are starting Chapter 4, and we are going to look at Section 4.1. We're going to talk about classifying triangles today by sides and by angles. We're actually going to start with classifying by angles. This is on page 237 if you want to follow along in your book. There are different names for triangles depending on if you are classifying by sides or by angles. So if you look at these four triangles are all named according to their sides. And most of these you would have learned when you were little, probably in elementary school, but we need to make your knowledge of them a little stronger and also review those concepts that you learned so many years ago. So first of all, if you have an acute triangle, that means all three angles are less than 90. If you have an equiangular triangle, it's kind of like equal angles. It's called equiangular. That means all three angles are equal to each other. We're going to eventually in this chapter go on to learn that if angles of a triangle add up to 180, these would all be 60 degrees. And then in an obtuse triangle, you have one obtuse angle. You can't have more than one obtuse angle or your triangle will add up to more than 180, so there's only be one and the other two will be acute. And then you can also have a right triangle, and when you have a right triangle, again, you can only have one right angle because if you have more than one right angle, you wouldn't have enough to, you'd be adding up to more than 180. So these are the four triangle names by angles. Now there is going to be some overlap of some of these names. For instance, an equiangular triangle is automatically acute because all three angles are 60, so they're all less than 90. But we always want to give the best name for these triangles. So if I ask you for the best name of this triangle, even though acute is correct, it's not the best name. We want the most specific name, which would be equiangular. So make sure that you give me the most specific name anytime they ask for the name of a triangle. Okay, the other way that you can classify triangles is by sides. So this is on the next page. This is on page 238. There are only three names for sides. So an equilateral triangle has three congruent sides. You might also know this already, but later in the chapter we'll talk about an equilateral triangle also means that all three angles are equal. So it's also equiangular and they'll all be 60. An isosceles triangle, this one's a tough one to spell, so watch your spelling on this. You'll have at least two congruent sides. So notice that you have two sides that match. As long as you have at least two sides, you're isosceles. We'll talk about that in a second. And then scalene is if no sides are congruent. It's usually marked with three different measurements. So if all three measurements are different, that's called scalene. Okay, so there can be some overlap between these names. Because of the definition of an isosceles triangle, it says at least two congruent sides. That means an equilateral triangle is technically an isosceles triangle, but that's not the best name for it. So if you get a picture of a triangle with three congruent sides, even though you could call it isosceles, you would want to call it equilateral because that is the most specific name for it. Just keep in mind, this is hard to remember, but isosceles means at least two congruent sides. Okay, in an isosceles triangle, you have two angles that are going to match each other, just like you have in this picture two sides. If you have two sides that match, you'll have two angles that match. In a scalene, since no sides match, none of your angles are going to match. And like we said before, in an equilateral triangle, if all three sides match, then all three angles will match. Okay, so let's go to page 241. We're just going to practice classifying these. And even though it says to classify the triangles by just the angles, we're also going to add on the sides because we can actually get more specific than what the book is telling us to. Okay, so for number 15, if you look, there's one obtuse angle. So this is an obtuse triangle. But the other thing I notice is none of my angles match. So we could also call this scalene. Number 16, if you notice, two angles match. So if two angles match, that's going to make two sides match. So keep that in mind. The other thing I'm noticing is all of these angles are less than 90. So the classifying by angles would be called acute. But then if two angles match, I know it's also going to be isosceles because if two angles match, two sides would match. So this is an acute isosceles triangle. Okay, number 17. If you notice you have one 90-degree angle, this is going to be a right triangle. But then when I look at the angles, none of the angles match. So this is a right scalene. That's because no sides would match if no angles match. Okay, number 18. You could call this acute because they're all less than 90, but that's not the best name. This is equiangular. because all three angles match. And if it's equiangular, it's also considered equilateral. If all three angles match, all three sides will match. Number 19, all of these angles are less than 90, so we're going to call this acute. And then when you look, none of the angles match, so you could also call it scalene. So this is an acute scalene. And then on number 20, you have a 90-degree angle, so right away we know it's a right triangle. And then notice we have two angles that match. That's going to make two sides match, so this is going to be right isosceles. So not only can you name them according to their angles, you can also name them according to their sides. Okay, so down here, we're going to look at, not that one, I want to go down to 30 through 35. For this one, I'm only going to go over naming by sides because honestly, that's a little bit harder than naming by angles. So we're going to go over this picture, and your choices are going to be equilateral, isosceles, or scalene. Okay, I went through and I marked the picture with the additional things that we knew based on what they told me in this given part. So it's all marked for you. Now we're going to just run through these different names. Okay, triangle ABC, ABC. We have an 8, a 4, and something marked with a two segment bars. That is going to be scalene because the 8 and the 4 and the other one do not match. So ABC is scalene. Triangle AEF. So go AEF. So you have a 10 and a 5 and something marked with 3 tick marks. None of those match each other, so this one is also scalene. Number 32, triangle ADF. ADF. Okay, so we have a 10. These are going to add to 10, so those two sides match, and then this side has 1 tick mark. We don't know what that is. So two sides are congruent. If at least two sides are congruent, we call this one isosceles. So that is isosceles. Triangle ACD. ACD. Okay, this one has 2 marks, 4 marks, and 1 mark. So that is scalene. None of the sides match. Triangle AED. AED. So we're looking at this triangle right here. So we have 3 tick marks. We have 5 tick marks, and we have 1 tick mark. So that one is also scalene. None of the sides match. And number 35, triangle ABD. ABD. We have an 8, and then this one is ticked the exact same way, so that's 8. And then these, although these little ones are ticked differently, that whole thing is also 8. So 8, 8, and 8, that makes this triangle equilateral. So remember that each triangle will have 2 names, but they won't always ask you to name both names. Just make sure you know the difference between classifying by side names, which are equilateral, isosceles, and scalene, and then these are classifying by angle names, acute, equiangular, obtuse, and right.